Part 3, Chapter 1 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 3, Chapter 1, Education Based Upon Natural Law. Read by Mary Beth Shaw. A Healthy Brain. What I desire to set before the reader is a method of education based upon natural law. In the first place, we have considered some of the conditions to be observed with a view to keep the brain in healthy working order, for it is upon the possession of an active, duly nourished brain that the possibility of a sound education depends. Out-of-door life. The consideration of out-of-door life in developing a method of education comes second in order, because my object is to show that the chief function of the child, his business in the world during the first 6 or 7 years of his life, is to find out all he can about whatever comes under his notice by means of his 5 senses, that he has an insatiable appetite for knowledge got in this way, and that therefore the endeavor of his parents should be to put him in the way of making acquaintance freely with nature and natural objects, that in fact the intellectual education of the young child should lie in the free exercise of perceptive power, because the first stages of mental effort are marked by the extreme activity of this power, and the wisdom of the educator is to follow the lead of nature in the evolution of the complete human being. The next subject for consideration, a rather dry psychophysiological one, seems to me all the same to be very well worthy of attention as striking the keynote of a reasonable method of education. Habit, the instrument by which parents work. Quote, habit is 10 natures, unquote. If I could but make others see with my eyes how much this saying should mean to the educator, how habit in the hands of the mother is as his wheel to the potter, his knife to the carver, the instrument by means of which she turns out the design she has already conceived in her brain. Observe, the material is there to begin with. His wheel will not enable the potter to produce a porcelain cup out of coarse clay, but the instrument is as necessary as the material or the design. It is unpleasant to speak of oneself, but if the reader will allow me, I should like to run over the steps by which I have been brought to look upon habit as the means whereby the parent may make almost anything he chooses of his child. That which has become the dominant idea of one person's life, if it be launched suddenly at another, conveys no very great depth or weight of meaning to the second person. He wants to get at it by degrees, to see the steps by which the other has traveled. Therefore, I shall venture to show how I arrived at my present position, which is from one of the 3 possible points of view. The formation of habits is education, and education is the formation of habits. End of Part 3, Chapter 1.
Part 3, Chapter 2 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Witten, windyhillhomeschool.blogspot.com. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason, Part 3, Chapter 2, Children Have No Self-Compelling Power. An Educational Cul-de-sac. Some years ago, I was accustomed to hear, habit is 10 natures, delivered from the pulpit on at least one Sunday out of 4. I had at the time just begun to teach and was young and enthusiastic in my work. It was, to my mind, a great thing to be a teacher. It was impossible but that the teacher should leave his stamp on the children. His own was the fault if anything went wrong, if any child did badly in school or out of it. There was no degree of responsibility to which youthful ardor was not equal. But, all this zeal notwithstanding, the disappointing thing was that nothing extraordinary happened. The children were good on the whole, because they were the children of parents who had themselves been brought up with some care. But it was plain that they behaved very much as 'twas their nature to. The faults they had, they kept. The virtues they had were exercised just as fitfully as before. The good, meek little girl still told fibs. The bright, generous child was incurably idle, In lessons, it was the same thing. The dawdling child went on dawdling. The dull child became no brighter. It was very disappointing. The children, no doubt, got on a little, but each one of them had the makings in her of a noble character, of a fine mind, and where was the lever to lift each of these little worlds? Such a lever there must be. This horse in a mill round of geography and French, history and sums was no more than playing at education, for who remembers the scraps of knowledge he labored over as a child? And would not the application of a few hours in later life affect more than a year's drudgery at any one subject in childhood? If education is to secure the step-by-step progress of the individual and the race, it must mean something over and above the daily plodding at small tasks which goes by the name. Love, law, and religion as educational forces. Looking for guidance to the literature of education, I learned much from various sources, though I failed to find what seemed to me an authoritative guide, that is, one whose thought embraced the possibilities contained in the human nature of a child, and, at the same time, measured the scope of education. I saw how religious teaching helped the children, gave them power and motives for continuous effort, and raised their desires toward the best things. I saw in how far law restrained from evil and love impelled towards good. But with these great aids from without and from above, there was still the depressing sense of laboring at education in the dark. The advance made by the young people in moral and even in intellectual power was like that of a door on its hinges, a swing forward today and back again tomorrow, with little sensible progress from year to year beyond that of being able to do harder sums and to read harder books. Why children are incapable of steady effort. Consideration made the reason of the failure plain. There was a warm glow of goodness in the heart of every one of the children, but they were all incapable of steady effort because they had no strength of will, no power to make themselves do that which they knew they ought to do. Here, no doubt, come in the functions of parents and teachers. They should be able to make the child do that which he lacks the power to compel himself to. But it were poor training that should keep the child dependent upon personal influence. It is the business of education to find some way of supplementing that weakness of will which is the bane of most of us, as well as of the children. Children should be saved the effort of decision. That the effort of decision is the most exhausting effort of life has been well said from the pulpit. And if that remain true about ourselves, even when the decision about trifling matters of going or coming, buying or not buying, it surely is not just to leave the children all the labor of an effort of will whenever they have to choose between the right and the wrong. End of Part 3, Chapter 2. Part 3, Chapter 3 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Witten, windyhillhomeschool.blogspot.com. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 3, Chapter 3, What is Nature? Habit is 10 natures went on being proclaimed in my ears, and at last it came home to me as a weighty saying, which might contain the educational open sesame I was in quest of. In the first place, what is nature, and what precisely is habit? It is an astonishing thing when we consider what the child is, irrespective of race, country, or kindred, simply in right of his birth as a human being. All persons born with the same primary desires. That we all have the same instincts and appetites we are prepared to allow. but that the principles of action which govern all men everywhere are primarily the same is a little startling. That, for instance, the same desires stir in the breast of savage and of sage alike. That the desire of knowledge which shows itself in the child's curiosity about things and his eager use of his eyes is equally active everywhere. That the desire of society, which you may see in two babies presented to one another, and all agog with glee and friendliness, is the cause, alike, of village communities amongst savage tribes, and of the philosophical meetings of the learned. That everywhere is felt the desire of esteem, a wonderful power in the hands of the educator, making a word of praise or blame more powerful as a motive than any fear or hope of punishment or reward. And affections. And it is not only the same desires. All people everywhere have the same affections and passions which act in the same way under similar provocation. Joy and grief, love and resentment, benevolence, sympathy, fear, and much else are common to all of us. So too of conscience, the sense of duty. Content of the most elemental notion of human nature. Dr. Livingstone mentions that the only addition he felt called upon to make to the moral code of certain of the Zambezi tribes, however little they observed their own law, was that a man should not have more than one wife. Evil speaking, lying, hatred, disobedience to parents, neglect of them, were all known to be sin by these dark peoples, whom civilized or Christian teaching had never before reached. Not only is a sense of duty common to mankind, but the deeper consciousness of God, however vague such consciousness may be. And all this and much more goes to make up the most elemental notion of human nature. Nature plus heredity. Then heredity comes in, and here, if you please, is 10 natures. Who is to deal with the child who is resentful or stubborn or reckless because it is born in him, his mother's nature or his grandfather's? Think of the trick of the eye, the action of the hand repeated from father to son, the peculiar character of the handwriting, traceable, as Miss Power Cobb tells us is the case in her family, for instance, through 5 generations. The artistic temperament, the taste for music or drawing, running in families. Here you get nature with a twist. Confirmed, sealed, riveted, utterly proof, you would say, against any attempts to alter or modify it. Plus physical conditions. And, once more, physical conditions come into force. The puny, feeble child and the sturdy urchin who never ails must necessarily differ from one another in the strength of their desires and emotions. Human nature, the sum of certain attributes. What, then, with the natural desires, affections, and emotions common to the whole race, what with the tendencies which each family derives by descent, and those peculiarities which the individual owes to his own constitution of body and brain? Human nature, the sum of all these, makes out for itself a strong case, so much so that we are inclined to think the best that can be done is to let it alone, to let every child develop unhindered according to the elements of character and disposition that are in him. The child must not be left to his human nature. This is precisely what half the parents in the world and 3/4 of the teachers are content to do. And what is the consequence? That the world is making advances, but the progress is, for the most part, amongst the few whose parents have taken their education seriously in hand, while the rest, who have been allowed to stay where they were, be no more or no better than nature made them, act as a heavy drag. For indeed, the fact is that they do not stay where they were. It is unchangeably true that the child who is not being constantly raised to a higher and a higher platform will sink to a lower and a lower. Wherefore, it is as much the parent's duty to educate his child into moral strength and purpose and intellectual activity as it is to feed him and clothe him, and that in spite of his nature, if it must be so. It is true that here and there circumstances step in and make a man of the boy whose parents have failed to bring him under discipline. But this is a fortuitous aid which the educator is no way warranted to count upon. I was beginning to see my way, not yet out of the psychological difficulty, which, so far as I was concerned, blocked the way to any real education. But now I could put my finger on the place, and that was something. Thus, the will of the child is pitifully feeble, weaker in the children of the weak, stronger in the children of the strong, but hardly ever to be counted upon as a power in education. The nature of the child, his human nature, being the sum of what he is as a human being, and what he is in right of the stock he comes of, and what he is as the result of his own physical and mental constitution, this nature is incalculably strong. Problem before the educator. The problem before the educator is to give the child control over his own nature, to enable him to hold himself in hand as much in regard to the traits we call good as to those we call evil. Many a man makes shipwreck on the rock of what he grew up to think his characteristic virtue, his open-handedness, for instance. Divine grace works on the lines of human effort. In looking for a solution of this problem, I do not undervalue the divine grace, far otherwise. But we do not always make enough of the fact that divine grace is exerted on the lines of enlightened human effort. That the parent, for instance, who takes the trouble to understand what he is about in educating his child, deserves and assuredly gets support from above. And that Rebekah, let us say, had no right to bring up her son to be thou worm Jacob, in the trust that divine grace would, speaking reverently, pull him through. Being a pious man, the son of pious parents, he was pulled through, but his days, he complains at the end, were, quote, few and evil, end quote. The trust of parents must not be supine. And indeed, this is what too many Christian parents expect. They let a child grow free as the wild bramble, putting forth unchecked whatever is in him, thorn, coarse flower, insipid fruit, trusting, they will tell you, that the grace of God will prune and dig and prop the wayward branches lying prone. And their trust is not always misplaced. But the poor man endures anguish, is torn asunder in the process of recovery, which his parents might have spared him had they trained the early shoots which should develop by and by into the character of their child. Nature, then, strong as she is not invincible, and, at her best, nature is not to be permitted to ride rampant. Bit and bridle, hand and voice will get the utmost of endeavor out of her if her training be taken in hand in time. But let nature run wild like the forest ponies, and not spur nor whip will break her in. End of Part 3, Chapter 3. Part 3, Chapter 4 of Home Education Series, Volume 1. Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Laura Witten, wendyhillhomeschool.blogspot.com. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 3, Chapter 4, Habit May Supplant Nature. Habit is 10 natures. If that be true, strong as nature is, habit is not only as strong, but tenfold as strong. Here then we have a stronger than he, able to overcome this strong man armed. Habit runs on the lines of nature. But habit runs on the lines of nature, The cowardly child habitually lies that he may escape blame. The loving child has 100 endearing habits. The good-natured child has a habit of giving. The selfish child a habit of keeping. Habit, working thus according to nature, is simply nature in action, growing strong by exercise. But habit may be a lever. But habit, to be the lever to lift the child, must work contrary to nature, or at any rate independently of her. Directly we begin to look out for the working of habit on these lines, examples crowd upon us. There are the children trained in careful habits who never soil their clothes, those trained in reticent habits who never speak of what is done at home, and answer indiscreet questions with, "I don't know." There are the children brought up in courteous habits who make way for their elders with gentle grace, and more readily for the poor woman with the basket than for the well-dressed lady. And there are children trained in grudging habits who never offer to yield or go or do. A mother forms her children's habits involuntarily. Such habits as these, good, bad, or indifferent, are they natural to the children? No, but they are what their mothers have brought them up to. And as a matter of fact, there is nothing which a mother cannot bring her child up to, and there is hardly a mother anywhere who has not some 2 or 3, crotchets sometimes, principles sometimes, which her children never violate. So that it comes to this: given a mother with liberal views on the subject of education, and she simply cannot help working her own views into her children's habits. Given, on the other hand, a mother whose final question is, "What will people say? What will people think? How will it look?" And the children grow up with habits of seeming and not of being. They are content to appear well-dressed, well-mannered, and well-intentioned to outsiders, with very little effort after beauty, order, and goodness at home and in each other's eyes. Habit forces nature into new channels. The extraordinary power of habit in forcing nature into new channels hardly requires illustration. We have only to see a small boy at a circus riding 2 bare-backed ponies with a foot on the back of each, or a pantomime fairy dancing on air, or a clown behaving like an India rubber ball, or any of the 1,000 feats of skill and dexterity which we pay our shillings to see. Mental feats as well as bodily, though happily these are the rarer. To be convinced that exactly anything may be accomplished by training, that is, the cultivation of persistent habits. And the power of habit is not seen in human beings alone. The cat goes in search of her dinner always at the same time and to the same place, that is, if it is usual to feed her in one spot. Indeed, the habit of place is so much to the cat that she will often rather die of famine than forsake the house to which she is accustomed. As for the dog, he is still more a bundle of habits than his master. Scatter the crumbs for the sparrows at 9 o'clock every morning, and at 9 o'clock they will come for their breakfast, crumbs or no crumbs. Darwin inclines to think that the terror and avoidance shown towards man by the wild birds and lesser animals is simply a matter of transmitted habit. He tells us how he landed upon certain of the Pacific islands where the birds had never seen man before, and they lighted upon him and flew about him with utter fearlessness. To come nearer home, what evidence of the mastery of habit is more sad and more overwhelming than the habits of the drunkard, for instance, persisted in spite of reason, conscience, purpose, religion, every motive which should influence a thinking being? Parents and teachers must lay down lines of habit. All this is nothing new. We have always known that, quote, use is second nature, end quote, and that, quote, man is a bundle of habits, end quote. It was not the fact, but the application of the fact and the physiology of habit that were new and exceedingly valuable ideas to me, and I hope they may be of some use to the reader. It was new to me, for instance, to perceive that it rests with parents and teachers to lay down lines of habit on which the life of the child may run henceforth with little jolting or miscarriage, and may advance in the right direction with a minimum of effort. End of Part 3, Chapter 4.
Part 3, Chapter 5 of Home Education Series Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 3, Chapter 5, The Laying Down of Lines of Habit. Read by Lisa A. Begin it, and the thing will be completed, is infallibly true of every mental and moral habitude completed not on the lines you foresee and intend, but on the lines appropriate and necessary to that particular habitude. In the phrase unconscious cerebration, we are brought face to face with the fact that whatever seed of thought or feeling you implant in a child, whether through inheritance or by early training, grows, completes itself, and begets after its kind, even as does a corporeal organism. It is a marvelous and beautiful thing to perceive an idea, when the idea itself is a fine one, developing within you of its own accord, to find your pen writing down sentences whose logical sequence delights you, and yet in the conception of which you have had no conscious part. When the experienced writer reels off in this fashion, he knows that so far as the run of the words, the ordering of the ideas go, his work will need no revision. So fine a thing is this, that the lingering fallacy of the infallible reason established itself thereupon. The philosopher who takes pleasure in observing the ways of his own mind is a thinker of high thoughts, and he is apt to forget that the thought which defiles a man behaves in precisely the same way as that which purifies. The one, as the other, develops, matures, and increases after its kind. We think as we are accustomed to think. How does this bear on the practical work of bringing up children? In this way, we think as we are accustomed to think. Ideas come and go and carry on a ceaseless traffic in the rut, let us call it, you have made for them in the very nerve substance of the brain. You do not deliberately intend to think these thoughts. You may, indeed, object strongly to the line they are taking. Two trains of thought going on at one and the same time. And objecting, you may be able to barricade the way, to put up "No road" in big letters, and to compel the busy populace of the brain world to take another route. But who is able for these things? Not the child of immature will, feeble in moral power, unused to the weapons of the spiritual warfare. He depends upon his parents. It rests with them to initiate the thoughts he shall think, the desires he shall cherish, the feelings he shall allow. Only to initiate, no more is permitted to them. But from this initiation will result the habits of thought and feeling which govern the man, his character, that is to say. But is not this assuming too much, seeing that, to sum up roughly all we understand by heredity, a child is born with his future in his hands? The child is born, doubtless, with the tendencies which should shape his future, but every tendency has its branch roads, its good or evil outcome, and to put the child on the right track for the fulfillment of the possibilities inherent in him is the vocation of the parent. Direction of lines of habit. This relation of habit to human life, as the rails on which it runs to a locomotive, is perhaps the most suggestive and helpful to the educator. For just as it is on the whole easier for the locomotive to pursue its way on the rails than to take a disastrous run off them, so it is easier for the child to follow lines of habit carefully laid down than to run off these lines at his peril. It follows that this business of laying down lines towards the unexplored country of the child's future is a very serious and responsible one for the parent. It rests with him to consider well the tracks over which the child should travel with profit and pleasure, and along these tracks to lay down lines so invitingly smooth and easy that the little travelers going upon them at full speed, without stopping to consider whether or not he chooses to go that way. Habit and free will. But, supposing that the doing of a certain action a score or two of times, in unbroken sequence, forms a habit which it is as easy to follow as not, that persist still further in the habit without lapses, and it becomes second nature, quite difficult to shake off. Continue it further, through a course of years, and the habit has the strength of 10 natures. You cannot break through it without doing real violence to yourself. Grant all this, and also that it is possible to form in the child the habit of doing and saying, even of thinking and feeling, all that it is desirable he should do or say, think or feel. And do you not take away the child's free will, make a mere automaton of him by this excessive culture? Habit rules 99 in 100 of our thoughts and acts. In the first place, whether you choose or no to take any trouble about the formation of his habits, it is habit all the same which will govern 99/100ths of the child's life. He is the mere automaton you describe. As for the child's becoming the creature of habit, that is not left with the parent to determine. We are all mere creatures of habit. We think our accustomed thoughts, make our usual small talk, go through the trivial round, the common task, without any self-determining effort of will at all. If it were not so, if we had to think, to deliberate about each operation of the bath or the table, life would not be worth having. The perpetually repeated effort of decision would wear us out. But let us be thankful life is not thus laborious. For 100 times we act or think, it is not necessary to choose, to will, say, more than once, and the little emergencies which compel an act of will fall in the children's lives just about as frequently as in our own. These we cannot save them from, nor is it desirable that we should. What we can do for them is to secure that they have habits which shall lead them in ways of order, propriety, and virtue, instead of leaving their wheel of life to make ugly ruts in miry places. Habit powerful even where the will decides. And then, even in emergencies, in every sudden difficulty and temptation that requires an act of will, why, conduct is still apt to run on the lines of the familiar habit. The boy who has been accustomed to find both profit and pleasure in his books does not fall easily into idle ways because he is attracted by an idle schoolfellow. The girl who has been carefully trained to speak the exact truth simply does not think of a lie as a ready means of getting out of a scrape, coward as she may be. But this doctrine of habit, is it, after all, any more than an empirical treatment of the child's symptoms? Why should the doing of an act, or the thinking of a thought, say, a score of times in unbroken succession, have any tendency to make the doing of that act, or the thinking of that thought, a part of the child's nature? We may accept the doctrine as an act of faith resting on experience. But if we could discover the raison d'etre of this enormous force of habit, it would be possible to go to work on the laying down of habits with real purpose and method. End of Part 3, Chapter 5.
Part 3, Chapter 6 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 3, Chapter 6, The Physiology of Habit. Read by Lisa A. A work of Dr. Carpenter's was perhaps the first which gave me the clue I was in search of. In his Mental Physiology, a most interesting book, by the way, he works out the analogy between mental and physical activity, and shows that the correspondence in effect is due to a correspondence in cause. Growing tissues form themselves to modes of action. To state roughly the doctrine of the school Dr. Carpenter represents, the tissues, as muscular tissue for instance, undergo constant waste and as constant reparation. Even those modes of muscular action which we regard as natural to us, as walking and standing erect, are in reality the results of a laborious education, quite as much so as many modes of action which we consciously acquire, as writing or dancing. But the acquired modes become perfectly easy and natural. Why? Because it is the law of the constantly growing tissues that they should form themselves according to the modes of action required of them. In a case where the brain is repeatedly sending down to the muscles, under nervous control as they are, the message to have a certain action done, that action becomes automatic in the lower center, and the faintest suggestion from outside comes to produce it without the intervention of the brain. Thus the joints and muscles of the child's hand very soon accommodate themselves to the mode of action required of them in holding and guiding the pen. Observe, it is not that the child learns with his mind how to use the pen, in spite of his muscles, but that the newly growing muscles themselves take form according to the action required of them. And here is the explanation of all the mountebank feats which appear simply impossible to the untrained looker-on. They are impossible to him because his joints and muscles have not the same powers which have been produced in the mountebank by a process of early training. Therefore, children should learn dancing, swimming, etc., at an early age. So much for mere bodily activities. And here we have the reason why children should learn dancing, riding, swimming, calisthenics, every form of activity which requires a training of the muscles, at an early age. The fact being that muscles and joints have not merely to conform themselves to new uses, but to grow to a modified pattern, and this growth and adaptation take place with the greatest facility in early youth. Of course, the man whose muscles have kept the habit of adaptation picks up new games, new muscular exercises, without very great labor. But teach a plowman to write, and you see the enormous physical difficulty which unaccustomed muscles have in growing to any new sort of effort. Here we see how important it is to keep watch over the habits of enunciation, carriage of the head, and so on, which the child is forming hour by hour. The poke, the stoop, the indistinct utterance is not a mere trick to be left off at pleasure when he is older and knows better, but is all the time growing into him, becoming a part of himself, because it is registered in the very substance of his spinal cord. The part of his nervous system where consciousness resides, the brain, has long ago given a standing order, and such are the complications of the administration, that to recall the order would mean the absolute remaking of the parts concerned. And to correct bad habits of speaking, for instance, it will not be enough for the child to intend to speak plainly, and to try to speak plainly. He will not be able to do so habitually, until some degree of new growth has taken place in the organs of voice, whilst he is making efforts to form the new habit. Moral and mental habits make their mark upon physical tissues. But practically everybody knows that the body, and every part of the body, accommodates itself very readily to the uses it is put to. We know that if a child accustom herself to stand on one foot, thus pushing up one shoulder, the habit will probably end in curvature of the spine, that to permit drooping shoulders, and consequently contracted chest, is to prepare the way for lung disease. The physical consequences of bad habits of this sort are so evident that we cannot blind ourselves to the relation of cause and effect. What we are less prepared to admit is, that habits which do not appear to be in any sense physical, a flippant habit, a truthful habit, an orderly habit, should also make their mark upon a physical tissue, and that it is to this physical effect the enormous strength of habit is probably due. Yet when we consider that the brain, the physical brain, is the exceedingly delicate organ by means of which we think and feel and desire, love and hate and worship, it is not surprising that that organ should be modified by the work it has to do. To put the matter picturesquely, it is as if every familiar train of thought made a rut in the nervous substance of the brain, into which the thoughts run lightly of their own accord, and out of which they can only be got by an effort of will. Persistent trains of thought. Thus the mistress of the house knows that when her thoughts are free to take their own course, they run to cares of the house or the larder, to tomorrow's dinner or the winter's clothing. That is, thought runs into the rut which has been, so to speak, worn for it by constant repetition. The mother's thoughts run on her children, the painter's on pictures, the poet's on poems, those of the anxious head of the house on money cares, it may be, until in times of unusual pressure the thoughts beat in that well-worn rut of ways and means, and decline to run in any other channel, till the poor man loses his reason, simply because he cannot get his thoughts out of that one channel made in the substance of his brain. And indeed, that way madness lies, for every one of us, in the persistent preying of any one train of thought upon the brain tissue. Pride, resentment, jealousy, an invention that a man has laboured over, an opinion he has conceived, any line of thought which he has no longer the power to divert, will endanger a man's sanity. Incessant regeneration of brain tissue. If we love, hate, think, feel, worship at the expense of actual physical effort on the part of the brain, and consequent waste of tissue, how enormous must be the labour of that organ, with which we, in fact, do everything, even many of those acts whose final execution falls to the hands or feet. It is true, and to repair this excessive waste, the brain consumes the lion's share of the nourishment provided for the body. As we have already seen, fully a sixth or a fifth of all the blood in the body goes to repair the waste in the king's house. In other words, new brain tissue is being constantly formed at a startlingly rapid rate. One wonders at what age the child has no longer any part left of that brain with which he was born. The new tissue repeats the old, but not quite exactly. Just as a new muscular growth adapts itself to any new exercise required of it, so the new brain tissue is supposed to grow to any habit of thought in force during the time of growth. Thought here including, of course, every exercise of mind and soul. The cerebrum of man grows to the modes of thought in which it is habitually exercised, says an able physiologist. Or, in the words of Dr. Carpenter, any sequence of mental action which has been frequently repeated tends to perpetuate itself, so that we find ourselves automatically prompted to think, feel, or do what we have been before accustomed to think, feel, or do, under like circumstances, without any consciously formed purpose or anticipation of results. For there is no reason to regard the cerebrum as an exception to the general principle, that whilst each part of the organism tends to form itself in accordance with the mode in which it is habitually exercised, this tendency will be specially strong in the nervous apparatus, in virtue of that incessant regeneration which is the very condition of its functional activity. It scarcely, indeed, admits of a doubt that every state of ideational consciousness, which is either very strong or is habitually repeated, leaves an organic impression on the cerebrum, in virtue of which the same state may be reproduced at any future time in correspondence to a suggestion fitted to excite it. Artificial reflex actions may be acquired. Or, to take Huxley's way of putting the case, by the help of the brain we may acquire an infinity of artificial reflex actions. That is to say, an action may require all our attention and all our volition for its first, second, or third performance, but by frequent repetition it becomes, in a manner, part of our organization, and is performed without volition or even consciousness. As everyone knows, it takes a soldier a long time to learn his drill, for instance, to put himself into the attitude of attention at the instant the word of command is heard. But after a time, the sound of the word gives rise to the act, whether the soldier be thinking of it or not. There is a story, which is credible enough, though it may not be true, of a practical joker, who, seeing a discharged veteran carrying home his dinner, suddenly called out, "Attention!" whereupon the man instantly brought his hands down and lost his mutton and potatoes in the gutter. The drill had been thorough, and its effects had become embodied in the man's nervous structure. The possibility of all education, of which military drill is only one particular form, is based upon the existence of this power, which the nervous system possesses, of organizing conscious actions into more or less unconscious or reflex operations. It may be downlaid as a rule that if any two mental states be called up together, or in succession, with due frequency and vividness, the subsequent production of the one of them will suffice to call up the other, and that whether we desire it or not. Intellectual and moral education. Quote, "The object of intellectual education is to create such indissoluble associations of our ideas of things, in the order and relation in which they occur in nature. That of a moral education is to unite as fixedly the ideas of evil deeds with those of pain and degradation, and of good actions with those of pleasure and nobleness." End quote. But it is the intimate interlocking of mind and matter which is more directly important to the educator,
the idea which we have put broadly under the, by no means scientifically accurate, figure of a rut. Given that the constant direction of the thoughts produces a certain set in the tissues of the brain, this set is the first trace of the rut or path, a line of least resistance, along which the same impression, made another time, will find it easier to travel than to take another path. So arises a right of way for any given habit of action or thought. Character affected by acquired modification of brain tissue. What follows? Why, that the actual conformation of the child's brain depends upon the habits which the parents permit or encourage, and that the habits of the child produce the character of the man, because certain mental habitudes once set up, their nature is to go on for ever, unless they should be displaced by other habits. Here is an end to the easy philosophy of, it doesn't matter, oh, he'll grow out of it, he'll know better by and by, he's so young, what can we expect, and so on. Every day, every hour, the parents are either passively or actively forming those habits in their children, upon which, more than upon anything else, future character and conduct depend. Outside influence. And here comes in the consideration of outside influence. 9 times out of 10 we begin to do a thing because we see someone else do it. We go on doing it, and there is the habit. If it is so easy for ourselves to take up a new habit, it is tenfold as easy for the children, and this is the real difficulty in the matter of the education of habit. It is necessary that the mother be always on the alert to nip in the bud the bad habit her children may be in the act of picking up from servants or from other children. End of Part 3, Chapter 6.
Part 3, Chapter 7 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education, by Charlotte Mason. Part 3, Chapter 7, The Forming of a Habit. Shut the door after you. Do ye next thing. Lose this day loitering, and 'twill be the same story. Tomorrow and the next, more dilatory. The indecision brings its own delays, and days are lost, lamenting o'er lost days. Says Marlowe, who, like many of us, knew the misery of the intellectual indolence which cannot brace itself to "do ye next thing." No question concerning the bringing up of children can, conceivably, be trivial, but this, of dilatoriness, is very important. The effort of decision, we have seen, is the greatest effort of life. Not the doing of the thing, but the making up of one's mind as to which thing to do first. It is commonly this sort of mental indolence, born of indecision, which leads to dawdling habits. How is the dilatory child to be cured? Time? She will know better as she grows older? Not a bit of it. And the next, more dilatory, will be the story of her days, except for occasional spurts. Punishments?
No, your dilatory person is a fatalist.
What can't be cured must be endured, he says, but he will endure without any effort to cure. Rewards? No. To him a reward is a punishment presented under another aspect. The possible reward he realizes as actual. There it is, within his grasp, so to say. In foregoing the reward he is punished, and he bears the punishment. What remains to be tried when neither time, reward, nor punishment is effectual? That panacea of the educationist, one custom overcometh another. This inveterate dawdling is a habit to be supplanted only by the contrary habit, and the mother must devote herself for a few weeks to this cure as steadily and untryingly as she would to the nursing of her child through measles. Having in a few, the fewer the best earnest words pointed out the miseries that must arise from this fault, and the duty of overcoming it, and having so got the sadly feeble will of the child on the side of right doing. She simply sees that for weeks together the fault does not recur. The child goes to dress for a walk. She dreams over the lacing of her boots, the tag in her fingers, poised in mid-air, but her conscience is awake. She is constrained to look up, and her mother's eye is upon her, hopeful and expectant. She answers to the rein, and goes on. Midway, in the lacing of the second boot, there is another pause. Shorter this time. Again she looks up, and again she goes on. The pauses become fewer day by day, the effort steadier. The immature young will is being strengthened, the habit of prompt action acquired. At the first talk, the mother would do well to refrain from one more word on the subject. The eye, expectant, not reproachful, and, where the child is far gone in a dream, the lightest possible touch, are the only effectual instruments. By and by, do you think you can get ready in 5 minutes to-day, without me? Oh, yes, mother. Do not say yes, unless you are quite sure. I will try. And she tries, and succeeds. Now, the mother will be tempted to relax her efforts, to overlook a little dawdling, because the dear child has been trying so hard. This is absolutely fatal. The fact is that the dawdling habit has made an irrepressible record in the very substance of the child's brain. During the weeks of cure new growth has been obliterating the old track, and the track of a new habit is being formed. To permit any reversion to the old bad habit is to let go all this gain. To form a good habit is the work of a few weeks. To guard it is a work of incessant, but by no means anxious care. One word more: prompt action on the child's part should have the reward of absolute leisure, time in which to do exactly as she pleases, not granted as a favour, but accruing, without any words, as a right. Habit a delight in itself. Except for this one drawback, the forming of habits in the children is no laborious task, for the reward goes hand in hand with the labour, so much so that it is like the laying out of a penny with the certainty of the immediate return of a pound. For a habit is a delight in itself. Poor human nature is conscious of the ease that it is to repeat the doing of anything without effort, and therefore the formation of a habit, the gradually lessening sense of effort in a given act, is pleasurable. This is one of the rocks that mothers sometimes split upon. They lose sight of the fact that a habit, even a good habit, becomes a real pleasure, and when the child is really formed the habit of doing a certain thing, his mother imagines that the effort is as great to him as at first, that it is virtue in him to go on making this effort, and that he deserves, by way of reward, a little relaxation. She will let him break through the new habit a few times, and then go on again. But this is not going on. It is beginning again, the beginning of the face of obstacles. The little relaxation she allowed her child meant the forming of another contrary habit, which must be overcome before the child gets back to where he was before. As a matter of fact, this misguided sympathy on the part of mothers is the one thing that makes it a laborious undertaking to train a child in good habits. For it is the nature of a child to take to habits as kindly as the infant takes to his mother's milk. Tact, watchfulness, and persistence. For example, and to choose a habit of no great consequence except as a matter of consideration for others, the mother wishes her child to acquire the habit of shutting the door after him when he enters or leaves a room. Tact, watchfulness, and persistence are the qualities she must cultivate in herself, and with these she will be astonished at the readiness with which the child picks up the new habit. Stages in the formation of a habit. "Johnny," she says in a bright, friendly voice. I want you to remember something with all your might. Never go into or out of a room in which anybody is sitting without shutting the door. But if I forget, mother? I will try to remind you. But perhaps I shall be in a great hurry. You must always make time to do that. But why, mother? Because it is not polite to the people in the room to make them uncomfortable. But if I am going out again that very minute? Still shut the door when you come in. You can open it again to go out. Do you think you can remember? I'll try, mother. Very well. I shall watch to see how few forgets you make. For 2 or 3 times Johnny remembers, and then he is off like a shot and halfway downstairs before his mother has time to call him back. She does not cry out, "Johnny, come back and shut the door," because she knows that a summons of that kind is exasperating to big or little. She goes to the door and calls pleasantly, "Johnny." Johnny has forgotten all about the door. He wonders what his mother wants, and, stirred by curiosity, comes back, to find her seated and employed as before. She looks up, glances at the door, and says, "I said I should try to remind you." "Oh, I forgot," says Johnny, but upon his honor, and he shuts the door that time, and the next, and the next. But the little fellow has really not much power to recollect, and the mother will have to adopt various little devices to remind him. But of 2 things she will be careful: that he never slips off without shutting the door, and that she never lets the matter be
A cause of friction.
between herself and the child, taking the line of his friendly ally to help him against the bad memory of his. By and by, after, say, 20 shuttings of the door with never an omission, the habit begins to be formed. Johnny shuts the door, as a matter of course, and his mother watches him with delight come into her room, shut the door, take something off the table, and go out, again shutting the door. The dangerous stage. Now that Johnny always shuts the door, his mother's joy and triumph begin to be mixed with unreasonable pity. "Poor child," she says to herself. "It is very good of him to take so much pains about a little thing, just because he is bid." She thinks that, all the time, the child is making an effort for her sake, losing sight of the fact that the habit has been easy and natural, that in fact Johnny shuts the door without knowing that he does so. Now comes the critical moment. Some day Johnny is so taken up with a new delight that the habit, not yet fully formed, loses its hold, and he is halfway downstairs before he thinks of the door. Then he does think of it, with a little prick of the conscience, strong enough, not to send him back, but to make him pause a moment to see if his mother will call him back. She has noticed the omission, and is saying to herself, "Poor little fellow, he has been very good about it this long time. I'll let him off this once." He, outside, fails to hear his mother's call, says to himself fatal sentence, "Oh, it doesn't matter," and trots off. Next time he leaves the door open, but it is not a forget. His mother calls him back in a rather feeble way. His quick ear catches the weakness of her tone, and without coming back he cries, "Oh, mother, I'm in such a hurry," and she says no more, but lets him off. Again he rushes in, leaving the door wide open. "Johnny," in a warning voice. "I'm going out again, just in a minute, mother," and after 10 minutes' rummaging, he does go out, and forgets to shut the door. The mother, mistimed easiness, has lost for her every foot of the ground she has gained. End of Part 3, Chapter 7.
Part 3, Chapter 8 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 3, Chapter 8, Infant Habits. The whole group of habitudes, half physical and half moral, on which the propriety and comfort of everyday life depend, are received passively by the child. That is, he does very little to form these habits himself, but his brain receives impressions from what he sees about him, and these impressions take form as his own very strongest and most lasting habits. Some branches of infant education. Cleanliness, order, neatness, regularity, punctuality are all branches of infant education. They should be about the child like the air he breathes, and he will take them in as unconsciously. It is hardly necessary to say a word about the necessity for delicate cleanliness in the nursery. The babies get their share of tubbing, and unlimited washing is done on their behalf. But, indeed, scrupulous as mothers of the cultured class are, a great deal rests with the nurses, and it needs much watchfulness to secure that there shall not be the faintest odor about the infant or anything belonging to him, and that the nurseries be kept sweet and thoroughly aired. One great difficulty is that there are still some nurses who belong to a class to which an open window is an abomination, and another is, they do not all know the meaning of odors. They cannot see a smell, and therefore it is not easy to persuade them that a smell is matter, microscopic particles which the child takes into him with every breath he draws. A sensitive nose. By the way, a very important bit of physical education for a child is to train in him a sensitive nose, nostrils which sniff out the least stuffiness in a room, or the faintest odor attached to clothes or furniture. The sense of smell appears to have been given us not only as an avenue of pleasure, but as a sort of danger signal to warn us of the presence of noxious matters. Yet, many people appear to go through the world without a nose at all, and the fact tends to show that a quick sense of smell is a matter of education and habit. The habit is easily formed. Encourage the children to notice whether the room they enter smells quite fresh when they come in out of the open air, to observe the difference between the air of the town and the fresher air beyond, and train them to perceive the faintest trace of pleasant or harmless odors. The baby is ubiquitous. To return to the nursery. It would be a great thing if the nurse could be impressed with the notion that the baby is ubiquitous, and that he not only sees and knows everything, but will keep for all his life the mark of all he sees. If there's a hole in a' your coats, I pray ye, tent it. A child's among ye taking notes, and faith he'll print it. Print it on his own active brain, as a type for his future habits. Such a notion on the nurse's part might do something to secure cleanliness that goes beyond that of clean aprons. One or two little bits of tidiness that nurses affect are not to be commended on the score of cleanliness. The making up of the nursery beds early in the morning, and the folding up of the children's garments when they take them off at night. It is well to stretch a line across the day nursery at night, and hang the little garments out for an airing, to get rid of the insensible perspiration with which they have been laden during the day. For the same reason, the beds and bedclothes should be turned down to air for a couple of hours before they are made up. Personal cleanliness as an early habit. The nursery table, if there be one, should be kept as scrupulously nice as that of the dining room. The child who sits down to a crumpled or spotted tablecloth, or uses a discolored metal spoon, is degraded by so much. The children, too, should be encouraged to nice cleanliness in their own persons. We have all seen the dainty baby hand stretched out to be washed. It has got a smudge, and the child does not like it. May they be as particular when they are big enough to wash their own hands. Not that they should be always clean and presentable. Children love to mess about, and should have big pinafores for the purpose. They are all like that little French prince who scorned his birthday gifts and entreated to be allowed to make dear little mud pies with the boy in the gutter. Let them make their mud pies freely, but that over, They should be impatient to remove every trace of soil and should do it themselves. Young children may be taught to take care of their fingernails and to cleanse the corners of eyes and ears. As for sitting down to table with unwashed hands and unbrushed hair, that, of course, no decent child is allowed to do. Children should be early provided with their own washing materials and accustomed to find real pleasure in the bath and in attending to themselves. There is no reason why a child of 5 or 6 should not make himself thoroughly clean without all that torture of soap in the eyes and general pulling about and poking which children hate, and no wonder. Besides, the child is not getting the habit of the daily bath until he can take it for himself, and it is important that this habit should be formed before the reckless era of school life begins. Modesty and purity. The operations of the bath afford the mother opportunities to give necessary teaching and training in habits of decency and a sense of modesty. To let her young children live and grow in Eden-like simplicity is perhaps the most tempting and natural course to the mother. But alas, we do not live in the garden, and it may be well that the child should be trained from the first to the conditions under which he is to live. To the youngest child, as to our first parents, there is that which is forbidden. In the age of unquestioning obedience, let him know that not all of his body does Almighty God allow him to speak of, think of, display, handle, except for purposes of cleanliness. This will be the easier to the mother if she speak of heart, lungs, etc., which also we are not allowed to look at or handle, but which have been so enclosed in walls of flesh and bone that we cannot get at them. That which is left open to us is so left, like that tree in the Garden of Eden, as a test of obedience, and in the one case, as in the other, disobedience is attended with certain loss and ruin. The habit of obedience and the sense of honor. The sense of prohibition, of sin in disobedience, will be a wonderful safeguard against knowledge of evil to the child brought up in habits of obedience. And still more effective will be the sense of honor, of a charge to keep, the motive of the apostolic injunctions on this subject. Let the mother renew this charge with earnestness on the eve, say, of each birthday, giving the child to feel that by obedience in this matter he may glorify God with his body. Let her keep watch against every approach of evil, and let her pray daily that each one of her children may be kept in purity for that day. To ignore the possibilities of evil in this kind is to expose the child to frightful risks. At the same time, be it remembered that words which were meant to hinder may themselves be the cause of evil, and that a life full of healthy interests and activities is amongst the surest preventives of secret vice. Order essential. What has been said about cleanliness applies as much to order in the nursery, and orderly habits in the nurse. One thing under this head. The nursery should not be made the hospital for the disabled or worn-out furniture of the house. Cracked cups, chipped plates, jugs, and teapots with fractured spouts should be banished. The children should be brought up to think that when once an article is made unsightly by soil or fracture, it is spoiled and must be replaced. And this rule will prove really economical, for when children and servants find that things no longer do, after some careless injury, they learn to be careful. But, in any case, it is a real detriment to the children to grow up using imperfect and unsightly makeshifts. The pleasure grown-up people take in waiting on children is really a fruitful source of mischief. For instance, in this matter of orderly habits. Who does not know the litter children leave to be cleared up after them a dozen times a day, in the nursery, garden, drawing room, wherever their restless little feet carry them? We are a bit sentimental about scattered toys and faded nosegays and all the tokens of the children's presence. But the fact is that the lawless habit of scattering should not be allowed to grow upon children. Everybody condemns the mother of a family whose drawers are chaotic, whose possessions are flung about heedlessly. but at least some of the blame should be carried back to her mother. It is not as a woman that she has picked up a miserable habit which destroys the comfort, if not the happiness, of her home. The habit of disorder was allowed to grow upon her as a child, and her share of the blame is that she has failed to cure herself. The child of 2 should put away his playthings. The child of 2 should be taught to get and to replace his playthings. Begin early. Let it be a pleasure to him, part of his play, to open his cupboard and put back the doll or the horse, each in its own place. Let him always put away his things as a matter of course, and it is surprising how soon a habit of order is formed, which will make it pleasant to the child to put away his toys and irritating to him to see things in the wrong place. If parents would only see the morality of order, that order in the nursery becomes scrupulousness in afterlife, and that the training necessary to form the habit is no more, comparatively, than the occasional winding of a clock, which ticks away, then of its own accord and without trouble to itself. More pains would be taken to cultivate this important habit. Neatness akin to order. Neatness is akin to order, but is not quite the same thing. It implies not only a place for everything and everything in its place, but everything in a suitable place, so as to produce a good effect. In fact, taste comes into play. The little girl must not only put her flowers in water, but arrange them prettily, and must not be put off with some rude kitchen mug or jug for them, or some hideous pink vase, but must have jar or vase graceful in form and harmonious in hue, though it be but a cheap trifle. In the same way, everything in the nursery should be neat, that is, pleasing and suitable, and children should be encouraged to make neat and effective arrangements of their own little properties. Nothing vulgar in the way of print, picture book, or toy should be admitted. Nothing to vitiate a child's taste or introduce a strain of commonness into his nature. On the other hand, it would be hard to estimate the refining, elevating influence of 1 or 2 well-chosen works of art, in however cheap a reproduction. Regularity. The importance of regularity in infant education is beginning to be pretty generally acknowledged. The young mother knows that she must put her baby to bed at a proper time, regardless of his cries, even if she leave him to cry 2 or 3 times, in order that, for the rest of his baby life, he may put himself sweetly to sleep in the dark without protest. But a good deal of nonsense is talked about the reason of the child's cries. He is supposed to want his mother, or his nurse, or his bottle, or the light, and to be a knowing little fellow, according to his nurse, quite up to the fact that if he cries for these things, he will get them. Habits of time and place. The fact is, the child has already formed a habit of wakefulness or of feeding at improper times, and he is as uneasy at his habits being broken in upon as the cat is at a change of habitation. When he submits happily to the new regulation, it is because the new habit is formed and is, in its turn, the source of satisfaction. According to Dr. Carpenter, regularity should begin even with infant life, as to times of feeding, repose, etc. The bodily habit thus formed greatly helps to shape the mental habit at a later period. On the other hand, nothing tends more to generate a habit of self-indulgence than to feed a child or to allow it to remain out of bed at unseasonable times merely because it cries. It is wonderful how soon the actions of a young infant, like those of a young dog or horse, come into harmony with systematic training judiciously exercised. The habit of regularity is as attractive to older children as to the infant. The days when the usual program falls through are, we know, the days when the children are apt to be naughty. End of Part 3, Chapter 8.
Part 3, Chapter 9 of Home Education Series, Volume 1, Home Education. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Home Education Series Volume 1, Home Education by Charlotte Mason. Part 3, Chapter 9, Physical Exercises. Read by Lisa A. Importance of Daily. The subject of the natural training of eye and muscles was taken up pretty fully in treating of out-of-door life. I will only add that to give the child pleasure in light and easy motion, the sort of delight in the management of his own body that a good rider finds in managing his horse, dancing, drill, calisthenics, some sort of judicious physical exercise, should make part of every day's routine. Swedish drill is especially valuable, and many of the exercises are quite suitable for the nursery. Certain moral qualities come into play in alert movements, eye-to-eye attention, prompt and intelligent replies, but it often happens that good children fail in these points for want of physical training. Drill of good manners. Just let them go through the drill of good manners. Let them rehearse little scenes in play. Mary, the lady asking the way to the market, Harry, the boy who directs her, and so on. Let them go through a position drill, eyes right, hands still, heads up. They will invent 100 situations, and the behaviour proper to each, and will treasure hints thrown in for their guidance. But this sort of drill should be attempted while children are young, before the tyranny of malveillance sets in. Encourage them to admire and take pride in light springing movements, and to eschew a heavy gait and clownish action of the limbs. Training of the ear and voice. The training of the ear and voice is an exceedingly important part of physical culture. Drill the children in pure vowel sounds, in the enunciation of final consonants. Do not let them speak of walkin' and talkin', of a foine day and nice boys. Drill them in pronouncing difficult words, imperturbability, ipecacuana, Antananarivo, with sharp precision after a single hearing, in producing the several sounds of each vowel, and the sounds of the consonants without attendant vowels. French, taught orally, is exceedingly valuable as affording training for both ear and voice. The habit of music. As for a musical training, it would be hard to say how much that passes for inherited musical taste and ability is the result of the constant hearing and producing of musical sounds, the habit of music, that the child of musical people grows up with. Mr. Hullah maintained that the art of singing is entirely a trained habit, that every child may be, and should be, trained to sing. Of course, transmitted habit must be taken into account. It is a pity that the musical training most children get is of a random character, that they are not trained, for instance, by carefully graduated ear and voice exercises, to produce and distinguish musical tones and intervals. Let children alone. In conclusion, let me say that the education of habit is successful in so far as it enables the mother to let her children alone, not teasing them with perpetual commands and directions, a running fire of do and don't, but letting them go their own way and grow, having first secured that they will go the right way and grow to fruitful purpose. The gardener, it is true, digs about and dungs, prunes and trains his peach tree, but that occupies a small fraction of the tree's life. All the rest of the time the sweet airs and sunshine, the rains and dews, play about it and breathe upon it, get into its substance, and the result is peaches. But let the gardener neglect his part, and the peaches will be no better than sloes. End of Part 3.